Vita Carnis is an analog horror series created by Darian and Quilloy, and it's been one of the most popular, most followed, and honestly most scary analog horror series I've ever seen. And there's one solid reason why that is. Vita Carnis knows monsters. Monster horror is one that's less touched on in a modern horror sphere, maybe because some people consider it inherently silly. I mean, monster horror usually revolves around you being scared of something that has never happened and could never happen, which, if I had to guess, is why Hollywood tends to gravitate more towards slashers and ghost stories than monster movies nowadays. We might be seeing a bit of a resurgence with the more out there ones like Megan, but for the most part monsters are still pretty much phased out in favor of more realistic horror. Serial killers are real, and ghosts, well, everyone has their own ghost stories, but monsters are a different thing altogether. And Vita Carnis has some of my favorite we've seen in any analog horror series ever. Why do I love the Vita Carnis horrors so much? Well, let me explain by breaking down what I think makes a monster good and what each Vita Carnis monster does that makes them individually haunting. Let's not waste any more time and get right into it. Monsters are a hard nut to crack. Typically speaking, what scares one person isn't guaranteed to scare another in the same way. For example, growing up I had a huge fear of werewolves. My parents showed me Silver Bullet when I was way too young for that kind of thing, and it left a lasting impression. Even nowadays, that childhood fear of werewolves is a part of me now. Part of the reason I had a lot of fun with Resident Evil Village was because the lichens genuinely reminded me of that old fear I once had. However, I wasn't afraid of vampires. I had no reason to be afraid of well-dressed rich people with funny accents and a sunlight allergy because it was never something I found scary in the first place. Why? Maybe because my mom showed me Twilight, another movie I was also too young for. I mention these two monsters to demonstrate that the tricky thing about making a monster scary is making it universally scary. If your monster can't scare a crowd, congrats, you blew it. That's why, in my opinion at least, the best kinds of monsters are the ones that prey on fears that human beings simply can't shake off. For example, zombies. I know that not everyone is afraid of zombies, but come on, at one point in your life you probably were. I know some adults who struggle to watch zombie movies now. To me, what makes your usual Hollywood zombie scary is the versatility in what it can represent. With a zombie, you have a character who should be dead but isn't, a cannibal, which to most humans is inherently, not good, and in some cases, you have a representation of sickness and infection, another big human fear. The idea that this monster could be someone you know who died, now walking around feasting on other humans and spreading the sickness that makes them into other monsters, that to me is a well-rounded monster that's guaranteed to spread fear and awe. It doesn't have to be zombies, but those were honestly my best example because I feel most people have seen a zombie movie at one point in their life. They're one of the few monster movies that never really seem to go out of style. By the way, if you want a zombie movie recommendation, I gotta say Train to Busan or Wreck. Both are fantastic zombie horrors. So let's sum this up for what makes a good monster. A good monster is well-rounded in how it can be interpreted. It preys on common human fears, and most importantly to me, it needs to seem insurmountable. The weakness of the zombie, and part of why a lot of people don't like zombie movies if you ask me, is that most of the time, your average zombie isn't gonna do much against a guy with a gun or even a baseball bat. This is why you never see movies where it's one zombie doing all the work. They'd be down in an instant. But you throw in a couple hundred, or a couple thousand, and you can absolutely make that threat insurmountable. But for this discussion, and for Vita Carnis, we're going to consider that many of these monsters on their own must seem insurmountable. So with that out of the way, let's get started with the first monster on the list, the Crawl. The Crawl is not your typical monster by any textbook means. It doesn't seem to have a consciousness, it doesn't seem after you, and, well, it can even be eaten. The Crawl is a root or vine-like structure that functions as a plant while mostly resembling intestines or other meaty substances. It's considered majorly beneficial to the environment as it can be eaten by animals, cleans up debris as it eats, and when it dies, it serves as extremely powerful fertilizer. The Crawl does have a dark side to it though. and it comes with how the crawl functions as the spawning point of almost all the other monsters, which collectively are known as the Vita Carnis. The crawl is not inherently a threat, but it can produce muscular growths which then turn into the various other monsters from throughout the series. The crawl itself can also mutate and become something known as a harvester, but we'll get to that later. If there were anything specific I would say that makes the crawl scary, it's in how it can be a representation of infestation. It's said in the series that it first arrived in 1931, and scientists aren't sure where it really comes from, other than, well, Earth. It's not alien, and it's not demons. It's a new species that seems to function like any other, but leads to the absolute worst of consequences. I'm also going to use this time to bring up the trimmings, since those are pretty much the least dangerous of the Vita Carni outside of the crawl itself. They're small creatures who feed off of scrap, trash, and dead animals. They're omnivorous and can hunt, but will always prefer dead food to live food. So they don't really bear any threat to humans. Also, there's a makeshift campaign for trimming plushes. Yes, I bought one. No, I don't want to elaborate. Oh, but if you made it this far in the video and you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing so. It's absolutely free and it helps me out a lot, and you can opt out whenever you want to. Really, there's no downside and it helps me make more videos like this one, so please subscribe. The meat snake is the first thing I would call an actual monster from this series, being a long stretch of muscle that scavenges for dead animals. This is another monster that only eats dead things, but it has a gnarly side to it that I think makes it far worse than it may seem. The meat snake, to me, represents the fear of transformation. When it consumes a dead organism, the skull of that dead organism will work itself to the front of the snake and become its new skull. This can be animal skulls or human skulls. The fact that human skulls are even documented, though, should tell you there's something greater at play here. Apparently, meat snakes had a hand in the events of World War II, or at least the aftermath of the war. In Vita Carnis, one meat snake was found so engorged from overeating it blocked a train tunnel. When soldiers went in from the other side of the tunnel to find the other end of the snake, what they found was a massive mountain of human bones and skeletons. It seems that throughout the war, the power of the meat snake as a garbage disposal was discovered, and casualties were fed to this one in particular, resulting in its enormous size. This hasn't been confirmed, but in my opinion, it's what's implied. Regardless though, meat snakes, despite their creepier side, are far from the most terrifying entity in the series. It's when we get to the mimics that things really ramp up. Shut up. Alright, I know what you're gonna say. I just do.
The next creature is the Mimic.
Anyway, the mimics are the first entities introduced in the series that have humans as one of their primary preys, and this is when I actually fell in love with the series. What makes the mimic scary? Absolutely everything about it. It's a skinless humanoid, not quite alien in shape but way too far from human to be comfortable. The mimic to me represents several different common fears. First off, fear of non-humans that resemble humans. The best way to describe this is automatonophobia, but as I understand, this mostly applies to wax figures and robots, not fleshy animals that stand on two legs and hunt you down. The most terrifying thing about their designs is of course how they appear to be bare-muscled hunters that resemble the human shape, but not quite. That's another thing. The mimics are hunters. They'll often stalk prey to find their daily routines and attack them whenever they're most vulnerable, most often when they sleep. This ritual on its own raises so many red flags. Fear of being stalked or observed, fear of being hunted, fear of being attacked in your sleep, and it gets worse. How does a mimic avoid detection? Well, oftentimes, it will hide itself in your furniture, as it's able to contort or inflate its body at will. There really is a monster in the closet, but what happens when it finally catches you? Well, of course, it eats you, and apparently leaves quite a mess from what we hear in the video Mimic Defense Instructional Tape. But that's not even it. Mimics have 3 stages in their life cycle. Their first stage, they resemble a small mammal. Their second stage is the skinless humanoid, but after that it depends on the success of the mimic. If a mimic has a stable and consistent food source of humans, it will slowly become more human-like. It will still maintain much of its mimic features like elongated fingers or flat noses, but it'll grow a human-like skin over itself that hides its red muscle. Mimics can also wear clothes, which further helps them blend into crowds or general society. But what happens when a mimic eats a lot of humans? Like, a lot of humans? Well, then it becomes an elder mimic. Elder mimics are like the normal mimics, but designed to actually make you shit yourself before they kill you. For starters, their bodies turn almost completely black, save for a white face that makes it resemble things. This coloration makes it even stealthier than the already contortionist mature mimic, so boosting it by this much makes one of these things one of the most chilling threats in the Vita Carnis universe. And this is why I think Mimic may be the best monster in the series. Hands down, it covers so many grounds. It hunts humans in populated areas, just in case you thought safety in numbers was a thing. It's incredibly smart and can hide in places you'd never expect to find it. It'll observe you and stalk you before moving in for the kill. And when it's finally ready to do you in, it eats you. Also consider that almost any person you meet on the street could be a mimic in disguise as a human, perhaps even an elder mimic who has killed many, many before you. And just in case you figured a mimic out, maybe even got lucky and killed them with a gun or something, you can't rest. There will always be more, another one out to get you. How people can sleep at night in the Vita Carnis universe, I'll never know. Moving on from the mimics, we have the harvesters. Harvesters, hosts, and monoliths basically fulfill any fear the mimic didn't already, so these next few sections may be quicker than the last one. So, harvesters. As I said before, harvesters are essentially a mutation of the Crawl, being the only member of the Vita Carnis species that does not detach from its host node upon maturity. So, what is a harvester? The absolute last thing you want to see in the woods, that's for sure. Harvesters are large bulbs that jut out of the ground as fleshy growths, although the real story is happening under the ground. Harvesters have two different types of tentacles, one for attacking and one for feeding. The attack tentacles are larger and lay closest to the surface. When stepping on one of these tentacles, the tentacles attack, with two rows of spines that run along each side, each one injecting the prey with a different toxin. One is a paralyzing neurotoxin that prevents prey from running away, the other is an anticoagulant that prevents blood from clotting, bleeding out prey who get stuck. This is when the second set of tentacles come out. These tentacles are similar to the branches of the Crawl and absorb the blood as it spills out of its prey. After that, it's all over. In the series, it's basically said if you set off a harvester, there's nothing anyone can do to save you. In the main continuity, two people die to harvester attacks, a child and his mother who would try to save him. I think the main thing that the harvesters represent in terms of fear would be the fear of infestation once again, but also the fear of being trapped, or the fear of being ambushed. After all, nothing is visible above the surface save for the bulb, so when you're in harvester territory, you're basically stepping through a minefield that will slowly drain you of blood and consume you if you set it off. The host of influence is one of the more rare types of Vita Carni, but also one of the most dangerous. The host is permanently rooted in one spot and resembles the upper half of a humanoid, sans a face, as well as having these long quill-like tubes on its back. These quills are what make the host one of the most dangerous monsters in the series. In fact, save for the mimic, I would say the host is one of the greatest threats to humanity in the series. These quills launch a spore into the air that the host presumably makes in its own body. These spores, should they be breathed in or consumed in some way, will immediately affect the brain of whatever organism is unfortunate enough to consume them. After this, the victim will become gravely ill with plenty of symptoms, until eventually, the spores compel it to do one thing and one thing only: find the host. The victim will return to where the host is rooted and expose itself to the host, allowing the host to kill it via disemboweling. This process, as stated by the series, takes place over the course of 6 hours. However, there is a way around this. If the victim is contained for 36 hours after being infected by the spores, then their symptoms and want to go back to the host will dissipate, and they'll return to normal. So it seems pretty simple, right? If you're ever attacked by a host, have a friend lock you in a room for 36 hours, and you'll be fine, right? Well, not necessarily. The worst part about the host is that it has a helper. In Vita Carnis, there is a group called Carcass. Carcass seems to be some sort of shadow government or cult that worships the monoliths and the singularity, which is another entity we know pretty much nothing about, but maybe the origin of the Carnes. Carcass, as it turns out, seems pretty damn happy with the effect of the host's spores, which is why they've unveiled a new product, Flavor Enhancer. Although you may be intimidated by this cook's use of a gas mask when cooking Crawl 3 cheese penne, I assure you it's necessary, because consuming this spore will lead you right to the origin host. And Carcass had pushed this to a lot of people. According to an in-universe newspaper clipping, it broke sales records. In my eyes, the host and its spores represent a fear of mind control, because that is essentially what happens. Your mind is taken over, and you bring yourself to a monster that will kill you, and the worst part about it is that you were just trying to cook dinner. Absolutely horrifying. And that's another fear the host sets off. Or, well, Carcass, I suppose. The fear of conspiracy. Without getting too political, I would just like to say that conspiracy theories today are plentiful and frightening for many. Whether you believe in them or not, they have a profound effect on those who spread them around, out of fear that their government might be doing something behind their back to harm them. That's a pretty unique but socially relevant fear to prey on, and it's something I really, really have to applaud the series for trying out. And that brings us to our last monster, the Monoliths. Unlike other monsters in the series, the Monoliths don't really do much, and only exist on one island in Hudson Bay, Canada, where they surround a singularity, and they themselves are protected by harvesters. The Monoliths are massive creatures, made of hundreds of thousands of fibrous tissues, and don't really seem to serve a purpose, other than to stand and seemingly protect the singularity. They're part of a large mycelium network with one another, maybe indicating some sort of shared consciousness. We know very little about the Monoliths, other than that if they wanted to, they could cause real chaos. They are capable of using EMP in some way that disables electronic devices, which is bad when they're as tall as a building and we haven't invented the steam-powered helicopter yet. To me, the Monoliths are a representation of a fear of the cosmos. By all accounts, the Monoliths bring this story into a cosmic horror angle, similar to Local 58 or Gemini Home Entertainment. The idea that there are powers far greater than us in scope and scale is a troubling thought on its own, but the idea that they want to harm us is far more terrifying. It's why things like the Cthulhu mythos is so popular. Cosmic entities that want you dead for unclear reasons really gets to some people. However, I think the larger thing that makes the Monolith scary is in how they represent the fear of the unknown. The one time we ever see a Monolith act aggressive, it's devastating. But otherwise it just stands still all day every day. We don't know what they want. We don't know why they're here, and we don't know how to stop them if they ever become hostile again. Now tell me, wouldn't you like to know? As you can probably see by now, there is a secret to Vita Carnis's success with monsters, and that's in one strength: diversity. Almost every monster represents something different and preys on different fears a person might have. You might find one monster scary, you might find all of them scary, but there really is something here for everyone to be scared of. This is what many monster movies lack. Many of them lack that kind of one-size-fits-all approach Vita Carnis has to its horror. Whether you're scared of the Mimic, the Harvesters, the Host, hell, even the Meat Snake, I would say that Vita Carnis succeeded in what it set out to do. I love this series, and I'm excited to see where Season 2 brings us. At the end of the day, Vita Carnis showed myself and many others just how scary monsters can really be, and I'm hoping to see more when I shut the lights off tonight. Until then, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.